Hi there, and welcome back to my channel for another episode. I'm going to be talking today about the cars that were stolen and used in the Dublin and Monaghan bombings on the 17th of May 1974. So let's start off with the tale of a gentleman by the name of William Henry. We are going to have three Williams who will be the subject of the story today, or the events. The first gentleman was by the name of William Henry, as I said. He was a taxi driver. He operated in Belfast and he went to work as usual on the morning of the 17th of May. Despite the fact that there was a general strike, he had his first customer at around 9 o'clock in that morning, and the customer asked for another passenger to be allowed to join them. So he allowed that. He opened the door and another passenger got in. Then something strange happened, which was that they asked for another two passengers to be allowed to join. Okay, so he stopped the taxi again, and then another two people got in. And on this occasion, Mr. Henry was taken out of the taxi, bundled into the back, and the two new passengers put their feet on Mr. Henry to keep him down so he couldn't see where the taxi was going. So he was now abducted. He was now falsely imprisoned. The taxi, with whoever behind the wheel, drove off to an unknown location, but it must have been nearby because it was only a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. Mr. Henry was then held incommunicado and had a bag put over his head and had his hands tied behind his back. He was eventually released at around 2 p.m, but he was told that he was not allowed to go to the police or raise the alarm until 3 p.m. at the earliest, which was interesting, and in particular interesting because he was told that he was not to go to any police station other than one particular police station. He was told to go to Tennant Street RUC station, Royal Ulster Constabulary Station. So that was quite interesting, that he would be told to go to a particular station. And that is what he did when he eventually raised the alarm. There are some discrepancies around the exact timing. Then the second person was the next William on our list, and it was a gentleman by the name of William Scott. William Scott was a night watchman. He returned from work at around 8:30 in the morning, having been on a night shift all night previously. And at 10 a.m, he found himself, in unclear circumstances, awoken to men at his door who confronted him and held him captive in his house. As a result of this, his car was stolen. Now, what's strange is he said that the door was open. It's not clear if he meant the door was open as in unlocked, or it was actually open. But one way or another, it seemed quite curious that, particularly in Belfast at that time, the door would be left open. The men who held him captive, or whom he claimed held him captive, did not wear any masks. They held him in the upstairs area whilst they played cards downstairs. They took their gloves off to play cards, according to him. And later on that day, he was eventually released at 4 p.m. He was told that he could report it to the police, but that again, he would be required to go to the Tennant Street RUC station, which was exactly the same as had been told to Mr. William Henry. Now, what made things even stranger here was that he was told that he should not report it before 4:30, so this in itself wasn't strange, but he was told not to report it before 4:30 on pain of death. But he nonetheless did so anyway, according to his own account. He was told, don't report it before 4:30 p.m, half an hour after he was released, but he did so at 4:20 p.m, according to his account. Now, what we're talking about here is a relatively common, in the sense of being not a terrorist crime, or he wouldn't have any reason to believe that this was part of a cross-border conspiracy to murder loads of innocent people. And he was just told to hold off on reporting it. Why in those circumstances would he have risked his life by reporting it earlier than he had to do? I mean, if this was just a theft or joyriding or whatever, he would have had no reason to put his life at risk in that fashion. So there was quite a serious discrepancy in that respect. The other area in which there was a discrepancy was that an insurance official called to the door of Mr. Scott's house and observed Mr. Scott near the mantelpiece in the downstairs area with the men he claimed were his captors. The insurance official identified 3 men, whereas Mr. Scott had said there were 2. This was when Mr. Scott had claimed that he was being held upstairs. There's also the question of how Mr. Scott, if he had been upstairs, knew what the captors were doing downstairs, whether that was playing cards or anything else, and how Mr. Scott would have known that the captors had taken their gloves off. How would that specific detail have been known to him? So his case was particularly curious, and the author Joe Tiernan, in his book on the Dublin Monaghan bombs, quotes how he spoke to an individual, a close neighbour who Mr. Tiernan said knew Scott for years, and Mr. Tiernan quoted the neighbour as saying he was very great, he, as in Mr. Scott, was very great with the army. Soldiers returning from abroad, and particularly Germany, who had served here on earlier tours, brought home scores of presents. He'd see them going for the booze late at night, and they could be there half the night. He turned one of the upstairs bedrooms into a sort of shebeen and soundproofed the walls. He was very close to them, meaning the army. And Mr. Tiernan also says, during research for the book, I discovered that sometime prior to the bombings, Mr. Scott had developed close links with the British Army and turned an upstairs room in his house into a drinking shebeen where soldiers based at the local army camp visited regularly for late night boozing sessions. Then on the next page, page 78, Mr. Tiernan continues, neighbours say Scott was used and manipulated by quote-unquote evil men smarter than himself, and that it was an open secret in the area where the hijackers came from that morning. Moving on to the third of the 4 carjackings that took place that day, brings us on to the third William we are dealing with, which is a gentleman by the name of William Shannon. William Shannon was a mechanic, and he went to work as usual that morning. He arrived at around 8 or half 8. Then, not that long afterwards, a colleague of his told him that Mr. Shannon's car had gone. So being a mechanic, your car would be, I suppose, rather important, and that's something you might be inclined to take somewhat seriously. But that didn't happen, and he later explained that away on the basis that he said he thought what he had been told by his colleague was a joke. Seems perhaps a strange thing to joke about, and particularly considering that the backdrop of this was widespread civil unrest, where there were loads of carjackings, it would seem something you wouldn't take as a joke, unless it were too absurd to be true. And it wasn't too absurd to be true. It was something that could well have been true, and if it was a joke, it was a somewhat maybe cruel one. So it does seem like a strange thing to joke about in those circumstances, and it does seem strange that he wouldn't have I suppose discerned from his colleague's demeanour or whatever, from knowing his colleague, whether he was joking or not, or would have thought that he was joking when in fact he wasn't. So Mr. Shannon didn't raise the alarm about the theft of this car until 10:30 a.m., which had given the people responsible for stealing it ample opportunity to retreat. So that was the third car that was stolen. Then the fourth one that was stolen was not in Belfast actually, but in Portadown, and this was much later in the day, well into the afternoon, sort of mid-afternoon, in or around 3 p.m. The person in this case was a man by the name of Dermot Crossley. He was just out with his wife going shopping. He parked his car, and the vehicle was stolen by some people, and the theft was actually witnessed by a Church of Ireland clergyman. The clergyman subsequently went on record, went to the police, and told the police about what he had witnessed. The car by that stage had obviously long gone, but he was subsequently able to pick out the attackers, or the people who had stolen the car, from an identity parade, and the names he chose all corresponded to people who were known to have links to extremist Protestant paramilitaries. So those were the 4 cars that were stolen on that day and that were used in the Dublin and Monaghan bombings.